Hello, welcome to another live Google Hangout on the Living in Guaranteed, and today we're talking about an unusual topic in our Hangouts, to be honest, because we usually have focused on talking about Europe and America in essence, but now we're going on to the Asia-Pacific context, and specifically Thailand. We have a guest that will be sharing with us his perspectives as a Westerner, which means he's coming from Canada, living in Thailand for quite some time now, and he's Adrian Blackburn. Hi, Adrian.
Hello.
Thanks for being here and for your time, because it's 1 a.m. in Thailand. So
that's thank you, Marlen. These hangouts are pretty cool, so it's a privilege to be here.
Cool, yeah. Okay, so let's begin with giving a context onto the situation of you living there. Why are you in Thailand? How did you get there?
Well, at the moment, I'm actually just here doing a bit of research and on a bit of a holiday, actually. But initially, I came to Thailand to work. I was offered a job here as teaching in a high school. Spent about 3 years here doing that. I came here when I was 24. And I've also worked in private schools, teaching English, of course. It's a very big industry here. So lots of opportunities for Westerners like myself to just come over and get, frankly, pretty good jobs pretty easily.
Cool. So you were a teacher, and as such you were kind of realizing the context of people, well, mostly children, young people living in there. What has been your experience, not only as a teacher, but also witnessing their lives from that perspective?
Well, the teacher thing is significant because, I mean, you know, before I came here, I was, quite frankly, living a pretty modest, humble is a nice way of putting it, life. Like, I was living in a one-bedroom apartment, pretty, like, lower middle class by Canadian standards. And all of a sudden, just by virtue of getting this job, which was, of course, by virtue of me being a Westerner, you know, all of a sudden, it was like overnight becoming a teacher. I mentioned it's a good job, so all of a sudden, financially, I'm doing way better, especially in this country where the same money in the West would go a lot further in terms of your standing financially, but also just the position of being a teacher, especially in this country. It's a very sort of like high status, and status in general here is very important. So it's like all of a sudden overnight I went from kind of just being like a chum in Canada to being like this sort of figure with, you know, responsibilities and all these things. So I guess I'm mentioning that because that gave me the extra scope through which I did observe everything I was seeing, you know, because it's like all of a sudden I'm supposed to be, you know, almost like a role model, you know. And yeah, so of course, like some of the first things I noticed coming here, it was like, holy shit, because you just like, you come into town and just looking at, you know, just the buildings and the infrastructure and the visuals of your surroundings, like compared to the city I come from in Canada, Ottawa, which is actually a pretty well-kept city even by Canadian standards. Like, if people there saw just what it looked like here, they would be pretty appalled, as I was. And it's not like people here have that kind of reaction, but because, of course, you know, it's just standards, right?
Exactly. Let's talk about that, the standardization of poverty, because, I mean, I'm in Mexico, so that's kind of similar. I mean, even the environment I'm in right now kind of looks like that, and it's not the usual kind of idea of the high living standard. But if we go to Europe, go to America, Canada, that is seen immediately as poverty standards. But that is the majority in Thailand. So what has been your experience living in such conditions, and what have you realized in relation of this contrast of the crisis in the West and the crisis that it's like a chronic crisis in Thailand?
Well, I mean, again, for me, it was like actually, it was very difficult to, um, frankly, be kind of well off and have my own place that's quite nice and everything. And then like right next door to me, and for a large part all around me, there's like just all this poverty, and so I would have initial reactions like, geez, like how do the people here who sort of live like I do, who always live this way, like how can they live with themselves, kind of thing. But of course that is an ethnocentric viewpoint coming from what I know, because again, if this were Ottawa, like having little pockets of town that are like that, it's like people do have that reaction. So I guess I just had to realize that, well, if I had grown up this way, then I would have just seen this the same way they do, and find all the ways I can to just normalize it and justify it and say why well, this is just how it is, kind of thing. Which is actually, interestingly enough, something I've heard from both Westerners who come and work here, as well as a lot of Thai people I speak to, which is that elite people in this country and people in positions of power and status, if you were to make like a visual analogy, like you've got the worker and the boss, this is the worker and the boss in North America. Well, here this is the worker and this is the boss. In terms of, and I've just heard and experienced actually a lot, again, from both cultures, that really they just kind of do whatever the hell they want and kind of make up the rules as they go along. And it just, I guess the way I'm trying to characterize it is in a very sort of like laissez-faire, I deserve this, like no shame, no, so again, I guess coming from the Westerner typical bleeding heart perspective, when looking at these kinds of issues, that's like appalling to me. But again, I didn't grow up this way, so.
Yeah, that's also another aspect of our cultural programming, if we can call it that, and how because you're born into it and you don't question it, and how, as we were mentioning also in the description of this hangout, even with all the communications and so forth, people are still pretty limited. What can you say about this? You were mentioning points like freedom of speech is really non-existent, ignorance is really not an option necessarily.
Yeah. Well, I think that's maybe the difference in why maybe a Westerner, say, versus someone here would react differently that way, is because actually we're completely the same in that regard, in that in the West we do pretty much completely ignore this kind of stuff and have the same attitude. I guess we're just even that much more removed from it. We have that many more excuses and justifications as to why it's not our problem, that it's even easier for us to do. But I mean, in terms of us not understanding it, I mean, I guess that would be the reason why, because I can point to, like, oh, we don't hear enough about it in the media and we're just not educated and that's the reason why. But I think that is rather the outflow of, again, this mentality I mentioned, where we've already accepted, oh, it's not us, it's not our country, it's not our problem, and rather that's the reason, that's the mentality that facilitates why we're not educated on it, why it's not in the media, because especially the time we're living in now, like, we have the internet. If you want to know all these things, it's like 3 clicks away.
We have a question for you. It's from Anna, and she's saying, how would you say the Thai religious culture affects the standardization of poverty? And do you see an equivalent in the Canadian culture, for example, in relation to justifying inequality or poverty?
Yeah, for sure. I see actually a lot of similarities specifically to Canada. And I think those similarities are born of the fact that, in the international political scene, Canadians and Thailands play very similar roles, in that we really have very little role, we have very little voice, we just kind of are very complicit with everything the big guys do, the superpowers. And to characterize that, it would be the passivity, how passive we both are, both here and in Canada. Here, I guess, relating it to religion, I guess I could attribute it to the whole Buddhist thing, because that's how a lot of the Buddhist religion is used here, being spun within the whole orientation of, just be passive, don't think about it, just ignore it, and, karma will spit it out, or whoever, magically everything's going to work out as long as you're just a good Buddhist and, you do what you're told and that kind of thing.
Like let things be kind of mentality.
Yeah, just let it be. Even though there's a flip side to that where a lot of, frankly, control and abuse is actually facilitated and permitted through the religious establishment and ideologies here. I was really, for instance, when I was working in the high school here, I was blown away the first time I saw students being like caned, like with bamboo sticks, because this typically took place after the morning ceremony every morning, which was a Buddhist ceremony. It was a big, like, ultra-religious Buddhist ceremony. And then, like, 5 minutes later, I see a big lineup of students with the teacher at the front, caning, just waiting in line for their turn to be caned. And I remember that experience because it just blew me away, because after every single time a student would get caned, they would actually turn around and why the teacher, like sign of respect, versus I remember being in high school, knowing people who would pick fights with teachers they didn't like, so yeah, the sort of level of acceptance really blew me away.
Exactly, and also you were mentioning in relation to God and religion and so forth, there they justify that poverty, and the same we do in the West, but also in the West there's the idol, which is God, which is money. So that's also another point of view.
Pardon me, in the West there's...
You didn't hear?
No, I missed the last bit of that.
Okay. That in the West we have also the god called money, so it's very justifiable to simply aim at getting that success, and it seems that in Thailand it's more like the people that are in such elite positions come almost from the monarchical aspect or a feudalist type of situation, which is also the same in the West, but here it's more like we attempt to get to that position quite often.
Yeah, well, that's very true. But I guess the only distinction we'd then be looking at here is a matter of degree and levels, and with that, like, because really here so much of the control, like, yes, in the West we have all this fear, everything's fear, being rich, chasing money, keeping up with the Joneses. Here it's more like, violence is very much a part of daily culture and daily life. You see child abuse in public. You see mothers hitting their children in public. It's things that like I know in Canada, like if I saw it, like I'd probably intervene or like call the police or something.
That's something very common here as well, actually.
Okay, right. So and I guess that relates to, again, the economic status and the way that affluence, buys human rights, So yes, they're very similar drives, but I think here it's much more difficult to break out of these things, whereas in the West, it's like we've had it good already for a long time, and so much of what we're chasing is so much more of just a pathological choice, It's like when fear crosses that boundary into just becoming complete greed,
Exactly. We have another question for you. It's from Andrea Teo, and she's saying, maybe in Thai, Sawadee ka, Adrian.
Sawadee ka.
How do you say that? Okay, there you go. Can you talk about the whole prostitution and selling your girls to go and work on Fat Pong Road?
Yeah, money, it's just money. That was a fascinating subject to learn about here because, in Canada, typically, a lot of prostitutes, it's either a choice because maybe, they can actually make very good careers out of it, or it's really just a relatively small number that are like in trouble and they have serious financial problems, or maybe they're hooked on drugs or things like that. Here, because of the economic conditions, it's that much more common that you're really just getting like just regular, ordinary, household girls trying to help out their family. So yeah, actually, funnily enough, it's actually illegal here in Thailand. But yeah, it's rampant. It's everywhere. Actually, one of the biggest prostitution cities that I know of in this country is known as the King's favorite vacation hotspot. Actually, the school that I used to work at, there was a brothel literally on the same street about 300 meters down the road from the school. So it's everywhere. You can't ignore it. So again, this goes back to the whole point of things just being in your face, but just sort of beyond question by virtue of it being normalized.
And it's also part of the points where when we see, for example, even if you Google Thailand, the first point that comes up is tourism, which is a great part of the GDP of the nation, and also prostitution, which comes with Valentin's question: is it true that Thailand is known for the sex tourism, and how does this influence the society there? Which already.
Oh yeah, it's huge. I mean, apparently, from what I understand, there is a long history of this that predates when Westerners sort of started coming here in significant numbers. But that's been taken to the extreme with Westerners because frankly it's so easy. I mean, again, talking about the advantages I had coming here financially, a regular guy is all of a sudden escalates to rich or upper class here. So it's just a very easy place to exploit. I mean, poor people again are easy to exploit.
So that's the point that you were also mentioning in relation to how the Western takes advantage of the situation in third world nations, in essence.
For sure. Although, I mean, it's a situation where nobody wins, right? I mean, actually, I read a recent story about this Australian bank boss who was had this whole company based in Thailand, cheap labor. And the company, he was on the verge of going bankrupt, and he was going to fire all of his 300 employees here. So, the next time he came and visited Thailand, they pooled together their funds and hired a hitman. And all of a sudden, one day this bank boss was on the back of a motorcycle taxi one day, and a guy pulled up next to him and goodbye bank boss. So the consequences of these things become very unpredictable, and I think that's what a lot of Westerners don't realize. They just see the opportunity, but it's really playing with fire.
Cool point and perspective there. We have another comment from Rebecca Dalmas. She's saying we remain complacent in the inequality, but why not ask ourselves what a more equal society would look like in terms of the infrastructure around us? If the infrastructure were more equitable, would the society not be more at ease? And of course.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, infrastructure, I mean, when you're talking about infrastructure, I think you're just talking about access to basic necessities. Sorry, I'm just looking at the question here. Yeah, I mean, if we had a more equitable society, obviously, again, people would have the resources with which they could fight for just, these basic needs, which would completely transform all of our social dynamics and of course, what a place would look and feel like and all that, the whole experience.
Actually, we would have to eradicate the notion of there being third world countries and first world countries, because that in itself already in our mental schemes implies that we are by default accepting poverty as something normal, natural, or
we would, and from a certain perspective, like those conditions really are very just mental, because from my perspective, I just, it doesn't matter what country I'm in, I just see people who have money and people who don't, because there's pockets of this country that are very, very well off, and much richer than places from like where I came from. There's just a lot less of them.
We have another question from Anna. She's saying, in relation to ethnocentrism, did you found any of these ethnocentric bubbles bursting through you living in Thailand that you wouldn't have been able to break otherwise?
Absolutely, and that's a great question, because it wasn't until about a year after living here that I didn't even realize how ethnocentric I was. And really, ethnocentric, that's just a nice word for racist. I didn't know. And actually until, it was about a year after I was here, and I'd actually visited South Africa, and someone in South Africa happened to point that out to me. And I wasn't aware of it at the time, but I went, oh, geez. And I looked at the point and I went, yeah, I am pretty much basically racist. But I guess the whole point of all that being that these greater overbearing conditions that we're all a part of in the world have these very great social implications, and they're so extensive that you pick them up and you adopt them, and you fit your role within them without even necessarily realizing it. Because actually, when this was pointed out to me, my first reaction was to say, because the person basically said, oh, you think you're basically better than these people, like you're worth more. And my first reaction to that was, I was about to say, yeah, but they think I'm that too, But within about being, when I was about to say that, I realized, holy shit, Adrian, duh, you bought into it. You totally got fooled. Yeah, sure, everybody believed it, even they buy into it, but I got fooled. And I don't know, I guess it just goes to show you it doesn't really matter. These conditions really are just conditions, and even if the people on the losing side of it agree with it, it doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean that they're true,
I consider that that's also where we can start realizing that all of the inequality overall in the world is nothing else but also a point of complacency from one another. And this is also the point of the hangout, to realize that we might see Thailand as this very far away country, and we know barely nothing about it other than tourism and sex or prostitutes. But in terms of our reality, we can then start considering that, yes, there is part of ourselves in our own minds that is recreating these patterns by me seeing myself better than others. Andrea got disconnected. I don't know, Andrea, if she'll be able to watch the hangout later on. So we have another aspect to consider here, which is the relativity of freedom. You were mentioning in the writing that you made previous to this hangout how that operates in the Western idea and in Thailand, how you perceive it. So how would you define that? How would you exemplify it?
East and West notions of freedom. That's the question.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, again, it kind of goes back to, I mentioned the instance of, say, how violence, direct violence here is used as a means of control. When you have that from the age of a toddler growing up, that really shapes the mentality quite differently, and as a result, people here tend to be very, very careful about what they do. There's actually a cool side of that too, however, where people tend to maybe be a little more careful and contemplative before they act, whereas in the West we can maybe be a little bit too knee-jerk, a bit too overzealous. But I guess that's the difference, is in the West there's at least more inclination to do something, try something, So yeah, that's how I guess I would distinguish those notions of freedom and I guess fighting for your freedom for that matter.
And in relation also to what happens there in terms of nationalism, almost like revering this limitation, or as you said, it love and revere their own chains. Why would you say that?
Um, don't we all do it? Uh, I mean, to be specific, I mean, in the West, every country or even person for that matter seems to have their archetype of that they sort of relate to and can identify with. In the West, it's the whole celebrity culture thing. That's sort of the benchmark of Western culture and American nationalism. The archetype of freedom and success and all these things. Here, it's the royal family. The king here is sort of like a living god, frankly, and he sort of represents like the ideal like Thai. And I've got to be careful about what I say here because there are laws that don't permit, I can't be too negative here. But yeah, there's a strong association with the king as being this wonderful, positive figure, and he really is, again, revered like a god. I mean, it's extensive. If people from the West were to come here and just see the murals everywhere and the commercials on TV, and you've got to stand up before you watch a Hollywood movie and watch a big montage of the king, and if you go to the library in a school, all the books in the library are about the royal family, and all the news and TV is about what the king had for breakfast.
Yeah, like our celebrities in the West, kind of, or maybe some corporate brand that you see everywhere.
Totally. It just happens to be like this one guy here, and and in the West, it's like we almost, it's a bit deceptive because it's like, oh, wait, I can pick and choose which celebrity I can associate with, and if I like this celebrity and not that one, if I like Kurt Cobain and not Lindsay Lohan, and apparently I'm a rebel and I'm different, But yeah, so here it's one guy, and it's really across the board, and there's nobody ever saying anything bad about this person. But again, there's very severe physical consequences if you do such a thing. So it's like, how do you judge that? How do you blame that?
Yeah, so it's like the lack of freedom of speech, to say the least, that goes on there. So let's go on to the democracy or the democratic aspect that we tend to, in the West always kind of promote, like, oh, democracy is the greatest thing, and let's go and promote democracy, especially from America. But there we have like democracy, but at the same time, you got the king. So what's your perspective in terms of the contrast of the West and the idea of democracy, supposedly, which is non-existent from our perspective, and what's going on there in terms of democracy and the ongoing crisis and protests and so forth?
Right. Well, with the monarchy and the phony democracy here, it's the elephant in the living rooms, the same way that the corporations in the West are the elephant in the living room while we're having phony debates about red versus blue, Again, however, though, here you can't question it. You literally can't. Versus in the West, like we choose. Again, there is lots of information control, but we do have the thing called freedom of speech to a much greater degree, and so that's why I mentioned that ignorance in the West really is much more of a choice. With regards to the political struggle, though, however, what I found fascinating here was that all the riots and protests you see on TV and everything, when I actually investigated, it turned out to be that was largely the upper class minority. that's doing all the protests, which makes sense because really the poor people here, the poor majority are like really poor, so like they don't have time to go to Bangkok and protest and, you know, take time off work if they even have work. So that was very different because in the West typically it is the more underclass majority that's busy on the streets protesting. So that was fascinating.
In terms of the economic aspect, do you have any particular points that you'd like to mention? Because what we get here in terms of news is that, yes, people are rioting and everything's wrong with the current, is it the prime minister that's kind of like a feudal family that has taken over power there? So what have you seen there? What are the pros, the cons?
With regards to the economic reality, well, again, you know, I guess there's a certain degree of humbleness that comes with being a permanent underclass, and as a result, people here are maybe frankly a little bit more stable. So actually, I'm a firm believer that like if they ever did get an opportunity, they really could make quite a difference and do some real good here. It's just, again, they have very little opportunity. Whereas in the West, like we have so much opportunity and we just squander it, you know. Yeah, did I answer that question fully? I'm not sure if I got all of that.
Well, I mean, in terms of the protest and how people cannot really spend their money, well, their time, their money there.
Right, right.
I mean,
yeah,
already that places a perspective that's very important in terms of placing the contrast of the crisis there.
Yeah, no, protesting in the West, again, because we have so many more privileges, it's almost become a bit of a novelty. And like it's about time we really start picking up on that because frankly it's making no difference, you know.
Exactly. And what would you say in terms of the implementation of a solution that is, what I was also reading is that they're saying, well, maybe Thailand doesn't only require new elections, but actually reforms, changes within the system, which is not really only in Thailand. We know that if we go, you know, here in any other country in the world, if you go and vote, you will most likely vote for the same mentality, the same structure, the same paradigm, whether you are in the East and the West, but that they require a reform. So in terms of the living income guaranteed, would you say that it's viable for people to kind of begin understanding there are solutions outside of the current paradigm that exists there?
Well, again, you know, in any hierarchy, even though I would have the most faith in the people at the very bottom, the reality is they really can do nothing. There are genuinely people who would like to make a difference and have absolutely no hope of ever doing so because they can barely help themselves. When you break down national borders and you look at the world as a hierarchy, then you realize, okay, it's maybe the people, you know, the further you go up the pyramid, the more opportunity and the more, you know, the more opportunity people can actually make a difference. And, you know, people have said that Thailand has never been colonized. I mean, that's a joke because everywhere you look, there's Coca-Cola, Shell, you know, Tesco, like whatever. It's so I just don't think in the West we maybe realize, again, we take for granted the opportunities and the power and the privilege we really have. And that's an unfortunate thing about a lot of Westerners who come here is they simply don't see that bigger picture, and they'll tend to judge a lot of how things are here because, you know, it's easy to, you know, there's lots of problems, but we really take for granted our role within that greater picture and how we're actually direct. It seems indirect because of how extensively we've separated ourselves through relationships, but we really do play a very direct role in all of that.
That also ties in with a question that I saw that was before, and it was by Gabriel Aceves, and if you can place it again because now is the right moment. But it said something like that: is it our role or our place as people in, you know, well-established nations that can support Thailand or all of these countries that require that aid Is it really a matter of them not having the money, or would we have to actually consider that there are other ways to maybe empower these countries, to get to a point of stability? Because currently we see that, it's a crisis, and as a global crisis, we see no solutions. So that's why we're here. We want to propose.
Well, we're all part of it. Like, everybody's part of this bigger. Everybody's a piece of the puzzle in what we call humanity, right? But again, we can only do what we can based on our specific position and role within that whole bigger picture. And so I think even coming to grips with, what you can do and what difference you can make lies within really understanding your place within that whole bigger picture. And again, that's what coming here really assisted me with, is I really went, holy shit, like, I thought I had it before. I thought I was a nobody before. I thought what I did didn't matter. My choices were of no consequence. That's far from the reality of things,
Broadening our perspective precisely has been what has happened throughout this hangout, because we tend to only focus on maybe our crisis here and there in the West, but we don't tend to look at how others are living as a constant, chronic state of impoverishment.
For sure, I remember seeing a statistic somewhere that if you basically have access to the internet and a little bit of money in your bank account and food in the fridge and that kind of thing, and like a roof over your head, like, that alone puts you in like the top 10 percentile of the world's richest people. So yeah, pretty significant.
So here's a question by Gabriel. How can the people from other countries support a change within the issues going on in Thailand that has been discussed? Or should the change come more from the Thailand or the Thai people themselves, more than from the intervention from other countries?
Yeah, well, I guess I sort of answered that a little before. How much of a difference really depends on the power you have, and we've really got to remove a lot of this extensive brainwashing to actually see the role that we're really playing in all of this.
I would say also that, for example, in the context of living income guaranteed and the basic income movements that are going on around the world, it's mostly in Europe, a little bit in America that's taking a momentum. So from my perspective, I would say that it is those nations that would have to set example, so that then further maybe treaties can be created to empower these nations that are entirely, disempowered, either by the hierarchical structure that it's reigning there, or because of the West invention and intervention in these countries, which is mostly like a relationship of abuse. So by each nation focusing on themselves, their own, then you can set an example, but also maybe as an international community, the real meaning of international community, we can then focus on supporting all the countries that currently have no power, no say, because they're mostly impoverished. And that would be also like a goal as a human being, not merely as from this or that nation, but to create a real equal opportunity in the world. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, who you're helping and where they come from, all this stuff, again, I really think we kid ourselves by even contextualizing things with these relationships, because it really does just boil down to who has and who doesn't. And so if you do have money in the bank, you can be a person who can be a voice for so many that simply do not. I mean, money makes money. If you have any, that means you have some to invest in whatever you think is important to invest in. And again, just as I briefly mentioned before, this is not about altruism or giving a helping hand or whatever. It's simply a matter of recognizing that these relationships, for one, are not fair. They're not justified by any means. They're all facilitated through deception, manipulation. I mean, just the currency manipulation alone is a massive point, but because it's so normalized, we take it for granted. But none of it is deserving, And even if you don't care about that, like I also mentioned, there's very severe consequences to this kind of stuff. There's a sleeping giant that everybody's kind of ignoring within all this, and I for one don't want to have to face the consequences of that as being someone who did nothing and completely squandered the opportunity that I have to make a difference.
Very cool, Adrian. Any last words? We've already had a general view of everything that we wanted to share, but maybe in terms of a more personal aspect of how it has changed you as a person living there.
A lot of the most difficult experiences I had to endure and put myself through have been the most enriching and supportive. So I would encourage people to, turn off their TV set or put away their Budweisers or put away their bong or whatever it is people are busy with, and get into the stuff, the nitty-gritty stuff that maybe is not so pleasant and not so nice to look at, but man, oh man, is it rewarding, and you'll sleep a lot better at night if you do it.
Exactly. It's like a self-empowerment point, a self-education point that we usually bring up in this hangout, because that is what we see is also the seed that we have to cultivate in order for change to really emerge from ourselves as individuals, and changing the actual culture from merely, as you were saying, entertainment and just wanting to get wasted literally, to becoming aware of not only our country, our system, but the context of the world, and seeing how others are living, so that we can kind of place things into perspective and then see, okay, do we really want to continue this way as the abusers maybe in the West, or becoming the elite and ignoring the poverty of billions of human beings? And I would say that it's certainly not something that we have to eradicate from our mentality, but that implies that in our possibilities we have to conduct a change. And thanks a lot for that and for sharing your perspectives.
Okay, thank you, Marlen.
Okay, thank you guys for watching, and we will see you in another Google Hangout. If you have further questions for Adrian, you can place them in the YouTube channel. Also notice that we are broadcasting from another YouTube channel, so please subscribe if you haven't yet. Share this video, and if you also would like to participate sometime in this Hangouts, contact me in the link that I will share in the information section of this video. Thanks a lot, and see you next time. Bye.